Hello, Royal History Geeks. My name is Gareth Streeter. I am the creator of Royal History Geeks, and I'm joined by.
James Taylor, Royal Commentator.
Well, we are here today to give you the first in a new series of monthly podcasts where we are going to be giving you the royal roundup of the month that just was. So, what we're going to do every month is spend about an hour talking through what the highlights have been in terms of news around the current royal family and also take a dip into what the big things are that are happening in the royal history world as well. So, we're playing this one a bit by ear, so let's see how it goes. But do give us feedback. Do let us know how you think we could evolve the form, Matt, so that when we come to October's, we can make it even more relevant to your needs and desires because we at Royal History Geeks care nothing more than the needs of the geekiest of our listeners. So, James, it's worth us just setting a bit of context in that while I am more of a medievalist with a very, very enthusiastic interest in the royal family. You are very much a commentator on the royal family of the day, and you actually attend many of the events where people might see the royals at.
Quite a few, yes. And I mean, it's been quite busy in September as
Mm,
things have gone, because we had at the beginning of the month, the King and Queen were at the Braemar Games. And so that was a nice little trip up to Scotland. Then, of course, we had the death of the Duchess of Kent and her
mm,
funeral, which I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about shortly. We had a couple of visits by the Prince and Princess of Wales, and I saw the Princess of Wales in Suffolk, in Sudbury, when she was
mhm,
visiting the mill there, and that was very nice actually, because I think that's probably only the second or third sort of large solo visit where
mm,
people would have had the opportunity to go and see her this year, because we've not seen her attending very many events following her illness. And we've there have been others, but they've tended to be quite low key ones or not been announced
mm,
in advance. This was a rare occasion where people were able to actually turn up
mm,
and see her, and certainly it got very busy out there. You know, there were several hundred people turned up, and of course all the children there to wave their
mm,
flags as you get for Royal. It was one of those sort of old-fashioned type royal visits where there were a lot of people there and a lot of flag waving and all of
mm,
that, and
mm,
it did get a lot of attention. And then we also had recently as well the Duke of Edinburgh in County Durham celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of the railways, because the 27th of September is the 200th anniversary of the first trains being run on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the
mm.
first steam trains being run. And so he visited the Locomotion Museum at Shildon in County Durham, and then following that, also the Hopetown Museum in Darlington. And there was a replica of the Locomotion Number One
Mm.
locomotive that went between the two. And Prince Edward went on a short. He didn't actually travel between the two on the train, but he did go a short ride at Shildon in it. And what was also quite unexpected, but also quite a pleasant surprise, was that Sir Tim Lawrence was there as well, who is, of course, his brother-in-law, the Princess Royal's husband. And what was quite amusing is that when he arrived, he was just sort of stood in among the crowd, and then when the Duke of Edinburgh arrived in his car, he was then ushered into the VIP area and joined the lined up. And of course, he was introduced to his own brother-in-law, which was quite amusing. And of course, they found it very amusing themselves.
Mm, mm.
But it was a very happy, very jolly visit, and one of the sort of nice and you know, for me, who is a royal commentator but has always been interested in railways, following
Mm.
my dad's influence, you know, that's having the two big interests in your life collide, and so that was a very happy coincidence for me.
It's worth remembering, isn't it, that every month, amid all the big royal news, and certainly this month, we've had quite a lot of royal news. So we're going to be talking about some of the big events, like the Duchess of Kent's death and funeral, like the state visit, like looking at some of the perhaps slightly less positive coverage there's been around the the future of the Duke of Sussex and particularly this month the Duchess of York. Even amid all of that, there's still a lot of events that the royal family do up and down the country and indeed beyond these shores that keeps them busy but don't necessarily receive the same high profile as some of the others.
That's very true. And I think that the best example of that is probably the Princess Royal, who you
Mm,
will see in one day probably be in Hampshire in the morning. I saw quite recently there was a day when she was in Hampshire in the morning. Around lunchtime, she was somewhere in the Midland, fairly near me.
mm,
And then she was in Scotland in the afternoon. I mean, obviously, she looked up by helicopter and all of that,
yeah.
but it's amazing the number of engagements, not only the number of engagements that she does, but also the breadth across the country
Mm,
that she
mm,
regularly visits within a week. You can regularly see her on the South Coast, in London, in
mm,
Scotland in the same week, which you don't see quite as much with other members of the royal family. They do visit different
yeah.
parts of the country, and quite often, I mean, we've got the Duchess of Gloucester coming to Sheffield, and funnily enough, followed by the Duchess of Edinburgh only a few days later, also
Mm,
in the city of Sheffield. But you don't tend to see them in so many different places in the one day quite
mm.
so often as you do the Princess Royal.
Let's look then at some of the big, if you like, highlight events that we've seen, and perhaps the earliest and the saddest was the passing
Mm.
of the Duchess of Kent on, you were saying to me, it was the 4th of September, is that right?
Yes, she died at Kensington Palace in the evening of the 4th of September, and it was announced at around lunchtime the following day.
Mm,
And then she was 92. She'd been in declining health for a while. I mean, we saw her last well, it wasn't really public, but outside, almost a year ago at the
mm,
Duke of Kent's 89th birthday, because I mean, he's getting increasingly frail himself, but there was um, a to mark his birthday, one of the regiments that he had been involved in, because he served in the Royal Scots Greys, and so one of its successor regiments, um, their band played a birthday salute in the grounds of their home at Kensington Palace, and it was the
mm,
first time that we'd seen her outside in a wheelchair. We've not seen much of her in recent years. So, and when you remember that somebody is in their 90s and quite frail, it's not that much of a shock. But I think the fact that we've not seen very much
mm.
of her for quite some time means that you then tend to remember them when they were much younger, when they were much
Yes,
fitter,
yeah.
much more vital. And so it's shocking in that sense because you're not really expecting
Mm,
it in the same way as if you're seeing somebody and you see their decline in health. But also it's very sad because she was somebody who was, I think, somebody who was very different on the royal scene
mm,
because, of
mm.
course, she was born in Yorkshire. Admittedly, she was the daughter of a baronet. I mean, she
Yeah,
was not exactly, from Miss Ordinary from down the road, but she
yeah,
was
yeah.
somebody who came from, she lived in a very large house, Hovingham Hall, near York, but it was still a different part of the country. It wasn't
Mm,
part of the metropolitan set,
mm,
and also she was somebody who was, because she'd always been interested in music and she had taught music, she taught in kindergarten, she taught music, she'd studied music.
mm,
And so again, she'd had quite a different life. It wasn't
mm,
just the usual sort of life of somebody who was, very privileged and finishing school in dance steps and that type
mm,
of thing. It was somebody who had gone out and you know, pursued her passions and had traveled the world.
mm,
She'd been to places like Canada and Germany and Mexico and things like
mm,
that before she was married, particularly to music festivals and things like that. And then, of course, she was most known as a member of the royal family for presenting the prize at Wimbledon and, of
mm,
course, the FA Cup, because when the Duke of Kent was president of the Football Association, she was a great football fan herself, supported Liverpool. But then you also have to remember that she was well known for being compassionate and caring, and
mm,
because her name was Catherine, she was known in some circles as Caring Kate, and
mm,
so she was the president of the Samaritans for around 30 years or so. She was also a leading light in the hospice movement, and certainly in the building and acceptance of hospices for children. She did a film with ITN in the 1980s
mm,
about children's hospice. And later on, she visited various places in the world for UNICEF for children who had mental and physical
mm,
disabilities.
mm,
And then, of course, she gave up royal life after around 40 years or so
mm.
to then go and pursue her first passion, music, and was working sort of undercover as a music teacher in Hull. And then she also gave lessons in a rented flat near Kensington Palace, but also set up the music charity Future Talent because she had a one of her big ideals was that music should be a great leveler, but she felt that children who went to state schools just weren't given the same opportunities as children who were privately
Mm.
educated, and she was passionate about giving those children the same opportunities. So they had talent spotters and they gave bursaries and things like that. So if there were gifted and talented children in music, that they were given more opportunities than they would have done otherwise. And so I
It's,
think that will be one of her great
it's
legacies.
it's interesting with the Duchess of Kent. I when I was reading the obituaries, and they do talk about her giving up royal duties to go and teach music, I think it's worth remembering because I am old enough to remember actually when it was announced she was giving up royal duties in the 90s. I don't remember exactly what
Well,
year it was. I think it was
it was
96.
2002 that she finally gave up raw duties. She had been reducing them sort of gradually. She'd been teaching music in Hull since about 1996, and so there was around a 5 year period or so where she was combining that with raw duties. And you've got to remember that she was visiting places like Kosovo in as late as 1999.
Although
So
the
she was still doing some of those things, but she was sort of taking a step
what
back at the same. I
what
think it
what
was a
I
gradual
What
stepping away rather than
what I remember though, and I remember this very clearly as a child now, I might have been misreporting, was it was I think it was 96 where she announced that she was ill with ME and that she was
yes,
cancelling all immediate engagements. And that seemed to be I think she later decided that actually she had celiac disease, not ME. It seems that there was a period, something happened in the sort of mid to late 90s that perhaps caused her to rethink her life a bit. I don't
yes.
know.
I think that's probably true. I think that being ill like that did cause her to reassess her life. But as I say, I don't think it was a an immediate, a snap decision that that's it, I'm giving up royal life
Mm,
tomorrow. It was a gradual stepping away because we still saw her until 2001 at Wimbledon. She was still attending the Children of Courage Awards at Westminster Abbey in the late
mm,
90s. So it was, I think you're right, but I think it took a while for that to
mm,
crystallize into
mm.
what form that was going to take. And of course, the other thing we have to remember about the Duchess of Kent, which is directly relevant to the funeral, is of course that she was the first member of the royal family to convert to Catholicism
Yes,
in
yes.
1994. And because I think, and one thing that I think is overlooked, that she had always been somebody who was had a strong religious faith right from being young, and people, I think, quite wrongly assumed that that came when she converted to Catholicism.
Mm,
It was just that her faith took a different
yeah,
a
yeah.
different aspect, and not only did she convert to Catholicism, but she also did that with the full approval and the backing of the late Queen as
Mm.
well. And Justice Kent was on record of
And,
saying that she could not have been more supportive of her decision.
and the 90s was a time where quite a number of Anglicans changed to Catholicism, partly because of discussions going on in the C of
Yes,
E.
yes. There were a lot of people who did convert at the time, at the same sort of time, because because in 1994 we saw the first ordination of women
Mm,
as
mm,
priests in the Church of England. They'd been ordained as deacons before then, but the Duchess of Kent did make it known that that was not part of her
mm.
decision. It
Interesting.
was a gradual growth of spiritual growth
Mm, mm,
and a pull towards the Catholic faith, but it wasn't because she had any particular
mm,
dislike of the thought of women being ordained.
mm.
That
That's interesting.
she made that public at the time that that was not part of her
Mm,
decision making
mm, mm.
process.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, as you say, there was a bit of an exodus over that issue at that point in time. The thing I think is very interesting about the Duchess of Kent is she actually was someone that modelled a sort of half in, half out royal role that perhaps others have sought since. But of course, the parallels are highly inexact because although the Duchess of Kent was reasonably high profile, she was not the international media sensation that, for example, Prince Harry had been, and therefore the circumstances are incredibly different.
But you're right, certainly by the 1990s, when she was stepping away from those royal duties, she was, and it was very interesting that she gave interviews where she would noticeably say, "I prefer to be called Catherine than Her Royal
Mm,
Highness,"
mm,
and things like that. Um, but yet, she did give several receptions for Future Talent, her music charity,
mm.
at either Buckingham Palace or St James's Palace. And so she still took advantage of the doors
Yeah,
that
yeah.
life would open for her. So yes, I think you're right. There was the sort of half in, half out. But I think the fact that she did it quietly, she did it discreetly,
Mm,
and I think more pointedly, because I know we'll talk about the Sussexes a bit later, she never uttered a word of criticism against either the
mm,
late
mm,
Queen or her husband, any member of the royal family. And so therefore it was, I think, more acceptable because it was
mm,
she wasn't seen as trying to push any boundaries. It was just that she was living a life that was comfortable and
mm,
acceptable for her, and that she was widely admired
mm,
for it. And I don't think you know, I don't think she ruffled any feathers in doing so.
mm.
So I think that's the big difference.
It is a big difference, and I think by that stage her profile was certainly lower than others would
Hmm.
become, and of course she'd never quite known the mass media, social media
Yeah.
age that others would. But nevertheless, it is interesting that perhaps if things are done in the right way, there are these roles within the royal family that can be carved out, both to pursue causes of interest, but also to discreetly work as an anonymous individual to at least some
Yes.
extent, but while recognizing that parallels are inexact. Oh, absolutely. Thinking then about her funeral, you were at the funeral, weren't you? Not as a guest, but as a photographer commentator.
Yes. Yes.
How was the atmosphere? Was it well attended by members of the public?
Yes, it was. It was much busier than I thought, and they did allow for an area in the piazza outside Westminster Cathedral for members of the public to congregate outside. It would be very difficult to estimate how many people were there, but I will say it did get very busy.
Mm, mm,
When you looked behind, the crowds were, admittedly, it was quite a limited area, but the crowds must have been between sort of 10 and 15 deep
mm,
when the service was on. And you saw quite a lot of famous people there. Dame Penelope Keith was there, Dame Maureen Lipman, Rula Lenska, um, the royal biographer Hugo Vickers, who of course co-wrote the
mm,
Duke of Kent's autobiography with him, and Lord Linley, or Lord Snowdon as he is now, arrived
mm.
among the other guests rather than with the royal guests.
Oh,
But
right.
yeah, funnily enough. But then you also then did see all of the extended royal
Mm,
family
mm,
there, all of the not only the Duchess's immediate family, because she and the Duke of Kent had three children: the Earl of St Andrews, Lady Helen Taylor, and Lord Nicholas Windsor. And they sadly had a son as well, who was stillborn in
mm,
1977,
mm,
Patrick. But they, so all of their three surviving children and their families were all there. But you also had Princess Alexandra there, Prince and Princess Michael, and their families too,
mhm.
as well as the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, and of course the King was there. The Queen was ill that day, so she wasn't
Yes, yes, I
there
remember.
herself.
Yeah.
But you also had, and the Duke of Edinburgh was abroad, so he wasn't able, he was in Papua New Guinea, so he wasn't able to be there. And I thought that was rather sad actually, because he was actually her godson as well.
Right,
But the
right.
Duchess of Edinburgh was there, the Princess Royal, the Duke of York, and so the all the extended royal family were
And
there.
and of course, slightly bridging us on to our next topic, but there was some disquiet about the Duke of York's
Mm.
presence in the media, wasn't there, in the days that
There
followed?
was, yes, I mean there were certainly pictures that he was laughing and joking, being
Mm,
disrespectful. All I would say as a commentator is that I didn't notice that there was anything which really stood out about his behaviour.
mm, mm,
Because when they came out onto the steps, and one thing I think I must say is that the Duke of Kent is extremely frail these days,
mm,
but he must have an extremely iron will because he stood at the bottom of those steps with his walking stick and with his daughter supporting him. all the while that the coffin, and remember, a lead-lined coffin will take
mm,
a long
mm,
time to be taken down the steps and pushed into the hearse. I
mm.
really did admire
Yes.
watching the Duke of Kent. But after the hearse had left and the Duke of Kent and his immediate relatives had left, you did see the other members of the royal family there speaking to each other, exchanging pleasantries. And as somebody who was watching all of that, I
Yeah.
didn't notice anything untoward
Yes.
about the way in
Uh,
which Prince Andrew was interacting with them.
uh,
Yes, he probably was having a joke, but then so were other people around him. I don't think there was
yeah.
anything crass or disrespectful about his behaviour on
And
the
you
day.
do that at family funerals, like you do. I've, sadly, have been to family funerals. We all have, and they are times of course, where you are somber, but you do also joke with your relatives, and you do have. You're not joking at the occasion, but you're seeing relatives again, and
Mm,
you're interacting with
mm.
them, and there is joy to the occasion as well because you're celebrating somebody's life. But I think it brings us to a wider problem, doesn't it, with the Duke of York, in that he
Yes,
is generally regarded, I would say, by most members of the public as not really wanting to be seen functioning as part of the royal family, and I think there are very understandable reasons for that. However, even if he were a convicted criminal, he would still be able to attend his cousin's funeral,
yes,
and
and of
and
course we
therefore,
should point out that
and
he's
and
not
he is
actually
not,
being charged or convicted of anything.
he has not been charged or
No,
convicted. But my point is, even if he were, that
exactly.
you would still be able to attend a family funeral. And I think that's the and of course we all realize the royal family are not just a family and that certain considerations have to be made, but it is very tricky uh to know how else that could have been managed, really.
Well, precisely. I mean, I think the only other thing would have been if he had arrived and left by a side entrance rather
Mm,
than
mm,
being with the other members of the family. Because I saw some commentary. You know how there are these people who are great fans of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and so therefore hate the Prince and Princess of Wales and
mm.
anything that they do. So, there were then stories that it was that William was seen laughing and joking, and that Andrew is
Yes,
his
yes,
his
yes.
best friend, and all
Right.
things like
Oh,
that.
jeepers, yeah.
Well, yes, precisely. And so, when I look at things like that, you see where being seen in the same place as Andrew does mean that other members of the royal family then face some kind of censure for
Mm,
that.
mm,
But again, like you, I kind of think, well, what what is reasonable?
mm,
And I think that the king has been very careful to make a distinction between Andrew ever leading a public life, receiving public subsidy, representing
mm,
him, carrying out royal engagements. But he has allowed him to attend events which are family events.
yes.
So you see him. So I saw him in Windsor at Easter. So he was attending church with the members of the royal family. He wasn't at Sandringham last Christmas. There'd been unfavourable headlines about him and his links with Chinese spy just
Mm,
before Christmas. So I think that was the reason that he said that he was not going to attend because he didn't want to affect
mm,
other members of the royal family attending Christmas. But he has attended Christmas at Sandringham in recent years. And Sarah, Duchess of York, has gone to a lot of these events with him. So we do see them both there. And I think that for my money, I think that's probably a fair medium.
mm. I think for the Yorks, it doesn't help. They've had a bad 2 months, haven't they? Because obviously, I think it was either in July or August that I think August that the Andrew Loney biography,
Yes.
joint biography of Andrew and
Mm.
Sarah, came out, which I must confess I haven't read yet. I do have it, and but I've listened to many of the interviews, and I can't, having not interrogated the source material, I can't weigh how accurate it is. But certainly they do not come out of it well. And then, of course, we've seen at time of recording in more recent days, where an email from Sarah, Duchess of York, has come to light, in
Mm.
which she has said that Epstein was what was the phrase she used? Was
He was
a
a supreme friend of the family.
supreme friend of the
Supreme
family, and
friend.
this was after her publicly disowning and saying that she regretted her friendship with him, which I think is incredibly unfortunate that that has
Mm.
come to light, and I think does renew calls for the royal family to be seen once again, to put some greater distance between themselves and the Yorks. But I think it's a very difficult thing to do because what can the king do to in any way further diminish Sarah Duchess of York's status in that she is not really an active participant in the royal family at all. So it's difficult to know, other than their accommodation, what more could be done.
Well, I think that I mean, just looking at the Andrew Lowney book first, which
Mm,
I confess I've not yet read, but I have heard a lot of the interviews around it. I get the sense that with that, there's there's very little that we weren't aware of already.
mm,
We were aware of stories about Andrew having quite a pompous
mm, mm.
approach to life and to other people, and accusations that he had when he was special representative for trade, that he
Yes, yeah.
was adding on um, golfing trips
Mm, mm,
and
mm,
all of private holidays and things onto his official duties
mm,
abroad. And we'd heard stories about his womanizing. We'd heard stories about. Um, so I think that all of that is there's very little new information that we weren't aware of. We probably have more detail,
mm,
but
mm,
but
mm.
it doesn't. But I
It,
think that it
no,
doesn't
none of them change the
really.
parameters by
No, it
which we
doesn't really
assess.
affect the
Yeah.
way in which you think of him because it only confirms what was already in. Well, I say confirms. I mean, it adds weight to
Yes,
what
yes.
was already in the public discourse.
If anything, actually, the new things that were new to me, again, not having read the book, but had many interviews with the author, is things that might actually engender some sympathy for the Duke of York in terms of early childhood abuse situations, which seem
Mm,
to, it seems from what Mr. Loney is claiming, that the young Prince Andrew was subject to what we would probably consider sexual abuse as as a very
mm.
young person. And that might at least give some context to if any of his sexual behavior has fallen below the standards that most people would think are acceptable in any way. That might give some context without excusing
No,
that.
but I think the difference between all of that and the email which came out with Sarah, Duchess of
Mm,
York, is the fact that, as you say, she had publicly repudiated her links with Jeffrey
mm,
Epstein.
mm,
She had said that she regretted ever meeting him, which is
mm.
something that Andrew never said when he did his
No,
interview with
he
Panorama
said he still
years
didn't because
later.
of all the good it
Newsstand,
could
sorry.
have done, didn't
Yes,
he? Yeah,
exactly.
it was awful.
Um, yes, and whereas Sarah did not didn't go down that road. She said
Mm,
that she regretted ever meeting him, that it was one of the worst decisions that she ever made,
mm,
and she was publicly repentant. So then, for an email to have come out, admittedly, nearly
mm,
15
mm,
years later, where she had sent to him saying that because in the because she'd given an interview and she'd used the word paedophile, and she said, I
mm.
definitely did not use that word against you.
Yes, yeah.
And also, she said that he had been, given a great support to Andrew, to her, to all the family, and that
Mm,
he'd always been a supreme friend.
mm,
And so I think that in that, it's not necessarily the fact that she called him a supreme friend, because I think that we knew that he'd been a very close
mm,
friend of
mm.
her and of Andrew's, but it's the fact that she did that after
Exactly.
he had already said,
Exactly. And I think, obviously it gets tied into the whole Peter Mandelson
mm,
question. And I think people might not like the fact that people were ever friends with a man like Epstein, and they might question their judgment. But most people will accept there's a difference between being a friend and saying friendly things when certain things about him were unknown and saying them once things were known. So not only has the Duchess of York got that to contend with, she's also got the fact that it now makes it look like it's a mockery of her apology. But also I thought the defense that she gave in terms of saying, well, I had to do it for legal reasons because I thought he might sue me, was
mm,
I thought a very strange response because I'm not sure that many lawyers, if you were worried about legal action, and I'm not sure how much legal action you need to worry about in terms of a slander case from a man who's been convicted of paedophilia. But
Mm.
even if you were, it didn't read to me like the sort of email a lawyer would advise constructing.
No, well, again, I am no lawyer, but my understanding, having been involved in sort of some PR around court cases in my time,
Mm,
is that if somebody has been convicted of an offence, it is then not libelous to say that they,
absolutely.
you know,
Yeah.
leaving his case aside, if somebody were a thief, or I mean, or even something as well, not trivial in the sense that we don't want to
Mm,
see it in society, but if somebody were a fly tipper, you know,
yes.
if somebody then has been convicted of that, whether they've gone to court, whether they've paid a fine, what, or community rehabilitation, whatever the outcome, if somebody's been convicted of that, as my understanding is that you could not then be sued for libel for saying that they are
Well,
the
that's
thing that
why
they've
I'm
been
trying to
convicted of.
get my head around the timeline a little bit, because
Yes.
when was he actually first convicted by a court of law for, because I just try, this is what's quite strange about the whole incident. So she gave an interview saying that she regretted her association with him quite early,
Mm,
wasn't it? Sort of around 2012, 2013.
mm.
Was
Well, I
it
believe
that
it's 2011, but yes,
2011? When
yes.
was he actually convicted of? And then the email that she sent that's just come to light, that was similar. That was not long after that, was it?
No, it was a few weeks, as far as I'm aware, a few
Yeah.
weeks afterwards. Um,
I'm just trying to, I'm just looking up to see when he was actually um convicted for the first time because it doesn't to me make like I mean he's been investigated from as early as 2005.
yes,
Um but it may be that he hadn't been fully convicted. Oh no, he was convicted in 2008 by a
yeah,
Florida state court of procuring a
yeah.
child for prostitution
I was
and of assisting a prostitute.
Yes, I was going to say 2009, but yes, 2008. So, it was after his first conviction. So I think that
Mm.
her defense there to me seems weak, but then as I say, I'm not a lawyer.
Well, no,
But
we're not lawyers, but thing is, all right, now maybe sex trafficking is not legally the same charge as being a paedophile, but I really don't think someone would be on very strong grounds to take legal action against you for saying that, given that
no, and
context.
I also would question whether to apologize to somebody for using a word against them involves you having to call them a supreme friend. I think that you could say, I had no basis in saying
Yeah,
that without having to go into something which
exactly.
seemed
Yeah,
fairly intimate and fairly gushing.
yeah.
So I would question the words that she's used in
And
that.
legal letters are written more like, the Duchess of York is aware that the point of her statement was to make the following points. She did not mean to imply, it's just not written like a
Yeah,
cover your ass legal email. Now I get
no.
there's more of a, oh, he was going to destroy me and my family if I didn't do it. But it's very hard to wash with people. And I think she
Well,
has once again become a bit of a liability.
I don't really want to sit too much in judgment because I kind of think, well, I don't know all the facts, and I also don't know how I might have responded in the same way. But to me, it does seem very odd, and I don't think that there's just for me something that doesn't quite square up from in her defense.
Hmm.
What to what she was actually what she's saying she was accused of there. You're right, she is becoming a liability, and that's why several charities of which she's been involved in,
Yes.
including children's charities, have dropped her.
Hmm.
Also, she's a children's author, and so I
Hmm.
mean, we know that she's been writing children's books as long as 30 odd years ago with Budgie the Little Helicopter. But
Yes.
she wrote the first in a new series of children's books last year, and I
Hmm.
went to one of the book signings and saw her there. And I must say, I did find her, she was very charming,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
to meet her. But so she had a new book coming out in a few weeks' time and a series of book signings. They've all been
Hmm.
cancelled.
Hmm.
And so, whatever you might think of her and her association with Epstein, her defense of that, I think it is fair to say she's paying the price for it now.
I think so, and I think the worry though with the Yorks is given their appalling lack of judgment as a couple, not I know they're not a romantic couple, but as a pair, they
Well, are they a romantic? I mean, they're divorced, but they refer to themselves as the happiest divorced couple.
yeah, Andrew
So
Loney
you
thinks they are not in a romantic
Well, they may well
paradigm,
not be,
but
but I suppose the point I'm making is that there's always been that ambiguity around them. No one's ever
yes,
been quite
yes,
sure what.
and
Of course, now though, with all of this latest scandal, I mean, there've been calls for. I've seen in several newspapers
mm,
polls: should the king strip her of her Duchess of York title? And I think that's going to be that's to me that's the whole minefield of how difficult that is for
yeah,
somebody who has already been stripped of the title Her Royal Highness
yes, yeah,
and is only has that as a courtesy title
mm,
as the divorced wife of a peer,
yeah,
leaving aside that Andrew's a royal, but as the Justice of York.
mm.
And I would question, I know that you're more of an expert on this than I am, but I would question that even if Andrew was stripped of the Dukedom of York, which I
Mm.
don't actually see happening, but if he were, that she would be compelled to stop using that title.
No, I don't think she would. I mean, the only way Andrew could be stripped of his dukedom would be by Act of Parliament. So I guess they could always add a clause to it saying, and Sarah can't use, and Sarah must not use it either. So in that sense, Parliament
But I
could
think
do
that'd be much more
anything.
difficult to enforce against the person who wasn't granted that title herself anyway. And besides which, any of us could call ourselves Duke of York if we chose to. Anybody, well, one, you could change your name by default, but even if you didn't, anybody could be known by a different title
I
if they
suppose
chose to.
there probably gets to a point where it could arguably be sort of fraudulent, I suppose, depending on
Hmm.
what you're trying to do with it. But that would all be a court's judgment, and who wants to waste their time? The courts have got enough proper cases to be sorting out. I think the problem with this whole cut Andrew and Sarah off from everything, although I understand the righteous indignation, the problem with it is we have already seen that when it comes to money, their judgment is appalling. So if you cut them off from any connection or any dependency to the royal machinery, Andrew is always going to be Elizabeth II's son. There is no act of law or no act of judgment that can stop that. Therefore, he will always be able to attract attention. He will always be able to attract the interest of less reputable people that could give him money. And it is probably not a very good idea for anyone to surrender them entirely to their own bad judgment and to the spurious
And
characters they'd seek help from. Let's, for a moment, leave the glamour and the drama of the House of Windsor and take a little look in the Royal History Corner for this month. As ever, there are exciting new books coming out. There is brilliant research being done. And although I don't think this month we've had a good example of it, there'll no doubt be some great TV shows coming down the line as well, both documentaries and fiction. But we have had some great books. You, James, didn't you, went to hear Tracy Borman speak about her new book this month?
yes, so from controversial stories around the House of Windsor, controversial stories to the House of Stuart.
Mm,
Because Tracy Borman's new book is The Stolen Crown, looking at the accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne as James I. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, weren't we? About that well-known story, which we all thought was probably apocryphal. Well, Tracy Borman's evidence um, just show that it was about the deathbed of Elizabeth I, about how she was said to have raised her hand at the mention of James becoming king, and that later that was embellished further to that she'd made the sign of a crown above her head as James being her successor. Well, that was, as many of us would have suspected, was later Stuart propaganda.
mm,
That it was by far means settled that James was going to be Elizabeth's successor, and that he was, rather than him being one of a cast of, if not many, certainly several possible
mm,
successors. Although one thing I would say is that, and indeed Tracy Borman does go into this in the book and certainly spoke about it too, I still think that James would have been the front runner, one, because he was already a king, and
mm.
also because you had Elizabeth's ministers like Robert Cecil
Yes.
um, entering into correspondence with him, meeting with
Mm,
him. So I think that while it was no means a done deal, And I say that as because I mean Tracy Bowman spoke at length as well about Arbella Stewart, who of
Mm,
course was the granddaughter of Bess of Hardwick and lived at Hardwick Hall. So again,
mm.
not far at all from where I am. So I suppose I should be a great Arbella supporter. But again, she sort of lost any credit that she might have by actually being quite not only quite haughty, and she certainly incurred Elizabeth first wrath, but also um, very unwise and very flighty. And so one might actually compare her to just talking about Prince Andrew. You might actually compare her sort of personality to his in the sense of somebody who's quite haughty but quite unwise as well with it.
It's also difficult to see, isn't it, how she would have had a better claim than James. Because
Well,
who was
yes.
what? I'm not brilliantly familiar with her line of descent, actually. I've just tried to look it up on Wikipedia, which is always true, just to see where her claim comes from because it comes she because she from what I can see descends entirely from Margaret Tudor in
Mm,
terms of that being her
yes.
claim. And it was
Yes.
Margaret Tudor's line that was cut off by Henry VIII's will, which cuts off James, but it also cuts off Arbella.
Yes, but the difference is that Arbella was an English subject because, as well
She
as
was born
the
here, yeah.
not just cutting off Margaret's descendants, but also James was an alien, having been
Yes.
born in Scotland. Whereas, at least, even though, yes, you're right, under the terms of Henry VIII's will, which had cut off the descendants of Margaret Tudor,
Mm.
she was at least an English subject, and so she arguably had a better claim to the throne through that route.
Yes, and it was ambiguous before James the First's extension. There was often a thought that you had to be born in England too in order to ascend to the crown, which is
Mm.
why arguably why during the whole Wars of the Roses period, people like the Spanish and Portuguese royal families who had pretty good Lancastrian claims were never really seen as having even a stronger claim as the Beaufort line because they just weren't part of the scene. So in that sense,
Yes.
yes, tricky, isn't it? Because it's really good to explore these sorts of alternatives and to draw light to people that maybe haven't had attention until recently. But I think while I'm absolutely confident that all these stories about Elizabeth, effectively anointing her successor are apocryphal, and even ones that were said at the time would have been influenced by the politics of those that observed such encounters. As you said, ministers in Elizabeth's government had been preparing the way for James for some time, and James was basically succeeded reasonably quickly and unopposed. So I think that it was a reasonably ordered, managed transfer of power. Whether it was what Elizabeth wanted, that we will never know,
Mm.
I
I mean,
think.
Tracy Borman would argue that it wasn't unopposed and that he was quite
Interesting.
unpopular.
Okay.
But that I what I would my counter argument to that is that there were great popular uprisings against
Hmm.
James. People might have found who met him might, as she argues, found him quite dull
Hmm.
and not particularly likable. There weren't great uprisings against his accession. Yes, you had the gunpowder plot
Hmm.
within the space of 2.5 years. I'm not suggesting that everything was smooth sailing later, but you have to also remember that that was part of the religious wars and arguments,
Yes.
which were also fed with the ending of the Spanish War. So the gunpowder plot was much more complicated than just simply saying, well, James is unpopular and therefore they wanted to blow him up.
Well,
It
there's
evolved
that, as you
into,
say, there's that religious element, wasn't there?
yeah.
That was primarily about wanting to have more tolerance for Catholics, and I think. I mean, as far as I know, I'll need to read the book. It's certainly not my era, but I don't believe anybody was ever raising an army for Arbella or anything like that, were
No,
they?
no.
Uh, it's interesting. It's definitely one to look at. In terms, it's not the only big history book, however, of September. I was fortunate enough to attend the launch of Elizabeth Norton, Dr. Elizabeth Norton's new book, Women Who Ruled the World, 5,000 Years of Female Monarchy. And I am very pleased to say that we can now cut to a interview that I recorded when I spoke to Elizabeth earlier this week. So, Elizabeth, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for asking me on, Gareth. It's an absolute pleasure.
Well, not at all. The pleasure is all ours. So, women who ruled the world, probably quite a lot of our listeners will be primarily interested in British or English history. And of course, when we talk about queens and when we talk about women who were powerful, with the exception of a handful of individuals, we're talking about power behind the scenes, influence that happens at the edges, which may be of great consequence, but is not necessarily direct, is not necessarily traceable. But that's not what your book is about, is it?
No, so um, absolutely, a lot of women have power. Kind of what I would characterize as three men. So Eleanor of Aquitaine's a really good example of this. Incredibly powerful figure, and is powerful in her own right. But she's a queen consort, so she's kind of never doing things exactly in her own name. She's promoting her husband, she's promoting her sons. Um, so my book looks at the reigning queens or the female kings. So this is I kind of call them the faces on the coins. They're effectively the heads of state. So these are the monarchs. So Elizabeth I,
Mm,
Victoria, Isabel of Castile, for example, the women who reign in their own right. And I think that's really important to look at because actually these are women who are standing alone. They're not standing behind anybody else. Everybody's looking to them, and they're the head of state.
mm. And it's interesting, isn't it, that in the English system and then more latterly the British system, we've struggled with knowing exactly what to call women in this position or in many powerful positions. I thought it was very interesting when Charles became king a few years ago. Some people were surprised that Camilla was going to be known as queen or queen consort, and a few people said to me, "Well, Philip was only a prince, so why does Camilla become queen?" And some people thought it was almost an over promotion, suggesting that she was on the same level as the previous queen. But that's a problem we've had it's certain perhaps in our Western history, isn't it? We haven't really had a good name for a woman that wields power in her own right.
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised at how confusing people find it, but it's not a problem with people who find it confusing. It's a problem with terminology, and English is just a little bit inadequate when it comes to queens and what we call them. Because actually, the word queen always used to refer to the wife of a king. So until really maybe Matilda in the 12th century, although she uses Lady of the English. But really until the 16th century, there's not really you don't really need a word for reigning queen. So they get called queens. So we have Queen Mary the First, we have Queen Elizabeth the First. But actually, it's really a title that's for consort. So actually, really,
Mm,
it's Camilla who's got the correct title. And actually,
mm,
Elizabeth II possibly should have been called something else because it is bizarre that Elizabeth II is the queen and Camilla is the queen because it's clearly not the same role.
mm,
Not everywhere has this problem. So Hungary, they always crowned their reigning women as kings, as did
mm,
Georgia, Egypt. They're referred to as kings in the Pharaonic period. So it's not a universal thing. So I've had some blowback from people saying female kings don't be ridiculous, but actually it kind of makes sense. And it's not
mm,
that unusual. In Western Europe, it is, but actually, in the wider world, it's quite common to call a reigning woman a
mm,
king. And to some extent, I think the word possibly should be disgendered because there's another problem is that, and take the fact that Philip wasn't a king. The reason Philip wasn't a king is because kings outrank queens.
mm,
And that has always been a problem with the spouse of a reigning queen.
mm,
Mary, Queen of Scots, Henry Lord Darnley becomes King of Scotland and kind of outranks her. She
mm,
still retains power, but he's the first name on the coins, he's the first name on the deeds until he
mm.
obviously gets blown up. Um, so actually, it is a problem. So people are right to be confused by the term, but I think the problem lies in what we call the reigning queens rather than what we call the consorts. And really,
Mm.
we should be calling them kings, but I don't think it will catch on.
No, it's funny, isn't it? Because we've taken gender out of so many other job titles in a world where men and women are closer to competing equally than they were in the past. And of course, a lady mayoress is the wife of a lord mayor, but when a lord mayor is female, they are a lord mayor. So we can cope with it sometimes, but not up on perhaps the grandest of scales. And I suppose that problem you've just talked about the king being more powerful than the queen, in a very this is a huge statement of oversimplification, but that summed up Elizabeth I's dilemma in some ways
Yeah.
about her own marriage and her own future.
Yeah, and it continues. In fact, if you go to Roskilde Cathedral today in Denmark, you'll see it's kind of covered up waiting, but there's a joint tomb that's been prepared for Margareta II, who's obviously still alive, and her husband, Prince Hendrik, who died in 2018. Hendrik isn't buried there, and he will never be buried there. And the reason he said he didn't want to be buried with his wife is because she wouldn't make him a king. So in the 21st century,
Wow.
we've still got this problem about status of male consorts. So it still is an issue. Prince Hendrik was quite unwell towards the end of his life, which may have sort of coloured, what he was saying. But, he's saying he wants to be king of Denmark. And actually, he's a French nobleman. He's not, the heir to the Danish throne.
Now, another thing about your book, which perhaps will stretch the mindsets of some of the listeners, is some of us, and I'm afraid I'm terrible for this, I have a tendency to think that all good history is British and that British history began in 1066. But I have heard it argued that there was a world before 1066 and a world outside these islands. Your book covers quite a bit more of the world than that and quite a longer time period. So how was that in terms of, as a historian, using all the different skills and tools and resources and source materials that you had needed to have accessed to survey everything that was out there and to produce what is really quite an efficient and slick rendering of it in the form of a book?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a challenge. The biggest challenge was the language barrier, obviously, because you can't just read English language sources because for many of the queens, there aren't any English language sources. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find much about Juana la Beltranea in, English publishing, for example. So actually, language was an issue. So if it's kind of Spanish or German, I can kind of bash my way through it, really, taking advice on occasions. But, Mandarin, I needed to get that translated. Quite luckily for me, because most of the Japanese empresses were early, there aren't actually that many sources for them, which actually was quite helpful because most of them have been translated into English. So that was useful. But it was really important to use sources in national languages and in the Queen's native languages to get a sense of them, because people are portrayed differently. Elizabeth I is a much more positive figure in British sources than she is in Spanish sources, for example, which is interesting in itself. So that was a challenge. I went to a lot of the places. So I've been all around the world over the past few years, which was really good fun. But again, I think it's really important to go and use the local archives, to go and see the places that the queens were living in, to get a sense of, what they were, what their space was like. And actually, sometimes I kind of picked up the scent of new queens on the way. So I found Cora Gooseberry when I was in Sydney, for example, who is a member of the Aboriginal community in the 18th century, who is kind of promoted almost like a client queen by the British as a means to try and build community relations. So that was fascinating. But it has been a challenge. I mean, it was a good, fun challenge. I know a lot more about the history of Japan than I did before, which was interesting. But actually, it was really important to compare these women and to go global, because actually reigning queenship, as far as we know, is born in Africa. And actually, you can't just do it without looking at the wider world.
So one of the good things, I suppose, about all your travels was it created some pretty good Instagram content as well. And it's absolutely worth people following you on all your social channels, which we'll plug at the end. But before we get there, one of the things I've always loved about your work is because I think you have a stronger academic grounding than a number of narrative historians or history writers, including myself. You've always, I think, felt more comfortable with linking concepts and looking at things thematically as well as narratively. Approaching a topic like this, would you say, or to what extent would you say, there could possibly be themes that unite female rulers from Cleopatra to Elizabeth II that span 5,000 years? Are there things we could say hold true for all of them?
Yeah, there are absolutely themes. So the book is quite thematic in the way it's set out, but there are clear themes. I mean, we are, as a whole, a patriarchal species, and I think that's fairly uncontroversial, and it's global. No country anywhere in the world, until at least the 1950s or so, actively desired a queen. Margareta II of Denmark only became queen when they changed the law, because otherwise she had no claim to the throne. They didn't have female monarchs. So nobody wanted a queen. So you have that context really until really. I mean, to be honest, until the Maori queen became queen last year, there's been no queen almost universally who's been actively desired over a male, really. She was actually picked over her older brothers, which made huge headlines. But yeah, so I think that's a common theme. And that obviously plays into what these queens face, because actually queens tend to come at the end of dynasties. They tend to come at times of dynastic turmoil, possibly at times of dynastic collapse. But that's not necessarily the fault of the queens. And they're not, they're not perfect, these queens, but actually they tend to be a symptom of dynastic turmoil rather than a cause. You end up with a queen because your dynasty is falling apart. So I think that's worth remembering. And I think there are other themes as well. I mean, a big one was actually denying the fact that they're monarchs at all. And that came up time and time again. And actually, that comes up with the earliest queen in the book, Merneith. When Flinders Petrie, the great Egyptologist, was digging at Abydos in 1900, he came upon this wonderful tomb. He was digging it, it had a wooden ceiling, which is really rare in Egypt. It had 41 servants who'd been sacrificed to accompany the occupants to the afterlife, which is lovely. But they had their implements so that they could still keep working after death, which is nice. But he was going through it and go, yeah, this is a tomb of the fifth pharaoh of the first dynasty. This is fabulous. And then he read the stele more closely and went, oh, it's a woman, just a regent then. She's on king lists, contemporary king lists and later king lists. She's obviously a king. I mean, everything about her screams king. It's just that she's female. And you see that. Marguerite the First of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden is a really good example of this in the 14th and 15th century. She's never called queen in her lifetime. She's called the husband of her kingdoms. That's her title. For a lot of her time, she's the only monarch. She does bring in a great nephew at one stage as a kind of co-ruler, a junior co-ruler. But she's clearly the monarch. And actually, she only got promoted to Marguerite I in 1972 when Margareta became Queen of Denmark and said she was going to take 2 as her regnal number, which meant that Marguerite suddenly found herself back in king lists. She'd never been in them before. Empress Matilda is another really good example of this. She's never on the king list. She never appears on kind of the things you get in gift shops, rulers and things like that with monarch lists. She probably should be. We call her Lady of the English. We say, she wasn't crowned, but Edward V wasn't crowned and he's on the king lists. So those are sort of themes you get. I think there's a commonality of, being women rulers and being fairly unwanted. There's only really 2 queendoms, if you can call them that I've actually identified. One is the Kingdom of Kush, which probably should be the Queendom of Kush in Sudan and northern Ethiopia. And they have a whole run of reigning Kandakes who are queens, and they're pretty fabulous in the classical period. And also the reign queens of the Balabedo in South Africa, who are recognized in South Africa's constitution as a queendom. But actually, they've got a legal dispute going on at the moment about whether or not they're going to crown a king. So even a queendom might end up with a king.
It's fascinating, isn't there, how these stories are so fascinating. And there'll be people, royal history geeks listening to this who've never heard of any of these things going on, but would absolutely love to sink their teeth into it. So I think that's one of many reasons to recommend your new book. Where can people find it, should they be so minded?
Okay, so yeah, it should be in all good booksellers. I've seen it in quite a few Waterstones in the past few weeks. It's normally in the new history section. Actually, the cover, they normally face it outwards, which is nice. I think the cover's quite striking. Otherwise, it's on, all the usual sites, Amazon. It comes out in the US at the start of October. Audible, it comes out in a couple of days in the UK, and then start of October in the US. And I narrated that, so that was good fun with the pronunciations, actually, of some of the names I had to practice.
Wonderful. Well, I certainly won't be in any position to correct you. And final question. I've heard rumours as to what you might be working on at the moment or next. Are you able to shed any light on what might be coming next?
Yes. So while I was researching this, I was also working on an academic book on Jane Seymour, and that's due in at the end of the year. So I'm almost there with it. But I do need to actually pull my finger out and get that finished. But it's an academic book, but I've been delving very deeply into the archives. So there's a lot of new material on Jane in it, particularly looking at sort of land holdings and things like that. But I've fleshed her out as a more human person. She's not always that likable, but she's much more human, I think.
Fantastic. Well, that I think will be something people are very excited to hear. So we will watch the space on that. Until that time, where can people find you on social media?
Okay, so I'm on all the social medias, so Blue Sky, X, Instagram. I've just come onto TikTok, although I don't really have any followers yet. So if anyone wants to follow me, that would be lovely. I'm always E Norton History,
E.
which
Norton
seems
history.
sensible because it means you can always find me. There's a
Absolutely.
woman in America who got the Elizabeth Norton handle, so don't message her. Just message me.
Well, for now, everybody, go and follow the correct Dr. Elizabeth Norton, the history Elizabeth Norton, and make sure you buy Women Who Ruled the World 5,000 Years of Female Monarchy, available in all good booksellers. There you go. That was a great interview with Elizabeth. Really good to speak to her. James, does that sound like the sort of book you could see yourself reading?
Yes, it does. I mean, I think that we were just talking briefly about the misogyny that somebody like Arbella Stewart would have faced at the time of Elizabeth I's death, and I think that the stories of female rule are very often underreported, and it's only in later years when people have made the effort to go and study them more that we're hearing more about them. So I think that anything which does that is only a good thing.
Absolutely. And I think she's certainly going to, as I'm already reading the book and it's brilliant, but she's taking me outside my comfort zone, as I said on the interview, because, it goes pre-1066 and it goes outside the British Isles. And I think we're all the richer for that. Let's turn our attention back to current royal family news. The Duke of Sussex has been in the news again. He has visited his father. But I have a question for you, as someone that follows these things slightly more closely than I do.
Mm.
We know who visited his father, and which is wonderful, especially as we know his father hasn't been well. And since then, there's been a huge amount of speculation saying that Harry would like some sort of royal role, saying that the king is reluctant to give it. But my guess would be, as far as we know, we have absolutely no idea what the two discussed, and we have no idea what they just talked about such things. Am I correct, or do we know anything?
No, you're correct. We been an awful lot of speculation, but we actually know very little. I mean, there was a story only today about that Prince Harry felt like an official visitor rather than his son seeing his father when he was ushered in to see the king. But I don't think he was referring to the king himself, but
Mm,
around being received
yeah.
and shown in and all of those things in the same way that official guests are, which I suppose you would expect now because with him living abroad and not you know living just down the road. He doesn't just nip in to see his father like he might have done
Mm,
when he
mm,
was
mm,
when he was in the country. I think that with regard to Prince Harry coming, because there's been a lot of speculation about would he carry out royal duties, and will he have this sort of half in, half out role that he has been on record as saying that he wanted and that was denied to him. Well, I think that that's very complicated, really, to answer because we saw him when he was in the UK over 4 days carry out various engagements, both
mm,
in London and in Nottingham. And so he went to the Well Child Awards, he went to the
mm,
Diana Awards, and when he was in Nottingham, he visited a community radio station which he supported when he was a working member of the royal family and had
mm,
visited previously before he left the UK. And I also know that even after he'd left the UK and stopped being a working member of the royal family, he'd still, although he'd not visited them in the intervening 5 years, he had carried on supporting them and sent
mm, mm,
messages. And um, but there's a big difference between him attending events such as Well Child and the Diana
mm,
Awards and supporting a charity, and him doing that on behalf of the king and officially representing the king.
mm.
So you might look at what he's been doing and thinking that is a half in, half out. And I suppose in some ways it is. But you have to remember, he's not being funded publicly to do
Yeah,
that. He's doing that under his own steam, which he's entitled to do as any person who wants to
exactly. Yeah.
support charities would do. And any celebrity with a high profile
Mm.
would want to do, and charities would want them to be involved, and especially if you had a pre-existing relationship with them.
Mm.
So, he can do that. But I think that we're a world away from him officially representing the king and
I
receiving
don't see
public
how
custody.
I don't see how he can represent really represent the king or the institution of the monarchy when he has so publicly spoken against the institution of the monarchy. I don't see
Yes.
how you go from one to the other without some kind of public acknowledgement that
Mm.
you've changed your mind or you apologize, or even that it's okay because the monarchy have come around to your way of thinking now. But
Well, I
you
don't
can't
think
talk
there's any
about it as
in
this toxic machine and then
no.
represent it, can you?
Well, I mean, I remember when we spoke about this before, when we talked about his children and saying that if the monarchy is so toxic and the upbringing was so toxic, why would then you want your children to have the titles and to lead that
Mm,
life? And so here, why would he want to be half in, half out,
mm,
and have be coming to the UK more often and have the children involved in that? Not that he's not there's any suggestion that he has, but why would he
yeah.
want that if it's been so toxic and so bad for him? And also, why would he even even if the children aren't making public appearances,
Mm,
why would he want then a step closer to that with him
mm,
being in the UK and carrying out duties and whatever, but also, as well, you have to remember that there is the issue of their commercial ventures. So
mm,
they are both officially His and Her Royal Highness, but they gave an undertaking that they would not use those titles in regards to any of their commercial ventures.
mm,
And while so I think that that would again be complicated. I'm not saying it couldn't be worked out,
mm,
but I think that it's incredibly complicated if he were to be a Royal Highness, if he were to officially represent the King on the one hand, and
mm,
then on the other, that they're seen to be making money because even if they do not use the titles in connection
mm.
with that, the lines become very blurred. And if
It
you look
does, yeah.
when the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh first married and they had their own commercial ventures,
Mm,
they received a lot more scrutiny and a lot more censure, even though they weren't actually using their titles in their commercial ventures. They weren't actually
yeah.
doing anything they shouldn't, but they both in the end fell foul. And so their um, solution to that was to go inside the tent.
Perhaps ending on a slightly more positive note, not uncontroversial, but we have seen the royal family on full display and in full force at the state visit of the President of the United States of America this month as well. And I think many would say, whatever you think about the reasons behind the visit, they did a very good job of showing how Britain can exhibit itself on the world stage when we need to. What do you think?
Well, I think that when people criticize it and say, "Oh, why are the royal family sucking up to Trump?" Well, actually, it's not. It's the UK sucking up to America, if you want to use that term,
Mm, mm,
because the king, yes, the invitation comes from the king, but it actually comes on behalf of the UK, and it's
mm.
not to Donald Trump personally. It's to
Yes.
the United States, and I think people forget that.
Mm,
And of course, these invitations are, even though it's in the king's name, are issued on government advice. The
mm,
king
mm,
would not invite somebody for a state visit against the will of the
mm,
sitting government. So I think people forget all of that. I think that the state visit itself, certainly in turn, was you saw everything that you would usually expect to see. But of course, there was increased security. So I would say, and I might be slightly controversial in saying this, the only thing that I thought looked slightly off, slightly
mm.
laughable, was the carriage procession. For two reasons.
Right.
Firstly, because the weather hadn't been great, so they had to use closed carriages, which they do in the winter months. But because it was in mid-September, I think that the hope would be that they'd have used open ones because you get a better view of the occupants. But because of the security, they had put large screens
Mm,
on the long walk in Windsor, and the procession, rather than they normally take place either if the state visit is taking place at Buckingham Palace, goes down the Mall, and if it's in Windsor, goes down the High Street. But
mm,
this
mm,
was all behind closed doors, and so where usually you would have cheering crowds, there was nobody there, and so I think that
mm,
that was slightly eerie, and so looked slightly off. But in terms of the marching bands, in terms of the reception, all of that was marvelous. And of course, you had St George's Hall for the state banquet, and I actually think that that's a much nicer venue for state banquets than Buckingham Palace because St
mm,
George's Hall is certainly architecturally a much nicer setting, much older, more historic setting than the ballroom at Buckingham Palace, and
mm,
they all are in one long table, the full length hall, rather than the horseshoe shaped tables that you see
Mm,
in the ballroom at Buckingham Palace. And of course, you saw all of the great gilt being taken
mm,
out, all of the
mm,
great services, and you saw the full evening dress. So the king and the other royal gentlemen were in the Windsor dress,
mm,
evening dress, and of course you had all the ladies in the full evening gowns with tiaras and
mm.
decorations as well. And you know, I can see why we don't have quite as many of those occasions as we used to. So they used to dress like that for things like film premieres and
Yes,
first
yeah.
and they used to, and certainly state banquet, certainly state visits used to have gala opera performance or something like, oh, ballet or something like that, and we don't get those now. But I still think that when you look at that, you see something which is done very well here, and we do see in the continental European monarchies, but is
Mm,
becoming increasingly rare in the world. And I think that
yes,
when you're
yeah.
able to do something like that and you're able to do it well, I
Mm.
think it looks good. And I think that you can criticize the reasons for the state visit, you can criticize the visitor, but I don't think you can criticize the clockwork with which that visit
I
was
don't think you
carried
can.
out.
And I think you also can make, perhaps this is a personal point from me, and you might not necessarily agree, but bringing things as I do back to sort of political and global affairs perspective, I think it does show how monarchy is a huge advantage for the UK in that we can offer something on the world stage that not many others can, and that we can use that to our diplomatic advantage. I'm not saying in and of itself secures any diplomatic victory, but I think it does give the elected government and the civil service, if they want to, and if they have the skills to, and if they have the inclination to, an opportunity to build on that and secure diplomatic victories. And I think
Mm.
it does show a huge and real advantage of monarchy, which is why it irritates me when people say that monarchy these days is just a figurehead. I don't believe that. I think it does play an important political role. It is just never a party political role.
But I think that's the advantage, isn't it, of you having a head of state who is above party politics,
Yes.
because you then are not getting, because you have other people then to deal with those intricacies and those difficulties of the party politics. And
Yeah.
you have a head of state who is therefore more of a diplomat than a politician, I would say.
Yes.
And therefore you have them slightly further removed, but very well briefed, able to carry out those conversations. And I think that when you have a visiting head of state like Donald Trump, who is seen as
Mm.
having a bit of an ego and
Yes.
enjoys being made the center of
Sorry.
attention and having that great fuss made of him. I see you've got a little friend
I've
there.
been attacked by a Dasher, Bruce.
But when you have
Bruce also has an ego, I'm afraid.
but when you have somebody with that type of personality as well, then the type of ceremony that we offer in this country will only play to that advantage.
Yes, absolutely. And we've taken quite a generous view as to who we would give such an occasion to in the past. And in a democracy, people absolutely have their right to say what the states they belong to should or shouldn't be doing. But I think many would argue, including many people who are not particular fans of the current US administration, would still argue it's very much in Britain's best interest to have this lever at our disposal to pull when we think we should.
Well, indeed, and if you look at some of the heads of state that Elizabeth II
Yes.
received, so she had the Ceausescu's and she had Robert Mugabe, and at the time that they were received on their state visits, it was seen
Mm,
as being a priority for the British government of the day to maintain good international relations with those regimes. And it was only later that that was seen, that those relations were broken off. And so I think that
mm,
when you take the long view in history, you could, it's very easy to judge at the time, oh, we shouldn't be having those people here. Well, there are often reasons for it. And
yes.
it's, and, I think as well with somebody who is mercurial, like again Donald Trump seems to be, we can have a great success with the state visit now. That doesn't mean to say that in a year or 2 years' time that the situation may not change. But I would still emphasize that that's no reason not to roll out the red carpet if that is going to be to the country's advantage in doing so.
Yeah.
Um, I can give you a very brief and a little bit light-hearted vignette from that state visit,
Okay.
if you like. So you know when you saw the royal ladies appear in their tiaras at
Yes.
the state banquet. So we had the Princess of Wales in Queen Mary's Lover's Knot tiara, um, and we had the Princess Royal was in a tiara that she owns personally, her aquamarine pine flower tiara, which
Mhm.
came from Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother. Now, that tiara is actually on display in London at the moment at the Cartier exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And so it had to be taken off the display so that the princess could wear it for the banquet.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, and but the thing that I found slightly amusing about that is that she does have at least two other tiaras at home that she does wear
Mhm.
regularly. So, but she obviously felt that she needed to wear the aquamarines
To
that
be
night.
honest, if you can't wear the tiara you want to wear, what is the point in being a princess? If I was
Very
a
true.
princess, I tell you now, I'd be wearing whatever tiara I flipping well felt like on the day. But I'm unlikely to ever be a princess, I would say. Well, that was a very
For more
busy
reasons than
month,
one.
for more reasons than one. That was a very busy month to start with, but I think we've given a good summary. Is there anything else you want to say about the royal month that was September 2025 before we wrap up? Or as we wrap up?
As we wrap up, well, just that it's been one that's busy, but one that also was nice from a personal point of view for me was being present at Chatsworth for the Queen's Reading Room Festival,
Of
and so
course.
we did actually see the Queen come out, and because she's obviously taken great store in literacy and promoting
Yes.
literacy over the years, and so we saw her come out of the Orangery at Chatsworth, and there were book deposit stations for people to be able to give books to
Oh,
people who are less fortunate, may not be able to afford them, and so she came out. She put her books in the station, and she met people, and then she went back in. And so
well,
it
you
was it
you
was nice to be present for that.
you weren't just present, were you? You were performing, I believe, or was that a different occasion?
No, I was performing. Yes.
Oh, well. Well, we could leave it up to people's imaginations then as to.
No, I think you better explain
I
that.
think you better explain.
Okay, so I have been part of the Chats with Players company for a couple of years now, and it's a local amateur group, and we
Hmm.
perform in the theatre at Chatsworth House, and we did a production of Pride and Prejudice earlier in the year, and so we were asked to go along and perform outside in the garden at Queen's Reading Room Festival.
Wonderful. Were you Mr. Darcy?
No, you know I wasn't Mr. Darcy. I'm nowhere near young and attractive enough for Darcy. So no,
Oh,
and I don't think I would suit a wet shirt. No, I was Mr. Collins. So
Mr.
I
Collins.
did
One of
get to
my
do my
favorite characters.
well, I did get to do my proposal, but I was cruelly rejected by that flighty
Oh,
pansy.
oh, obstinate, headstrong girl, that
Yeah,
Elizabeth
yeah,
Bennet. I've never
yes,
liked her.
obstinate and headstrong girl. Yes, you're quite
Yes.
right.
I've been a big Lady Catherine de Bourgh fan for many years.
Well,
And I
sadly, she
think,
wasn't able to be there at the weekend, but
well,
yeah,
that is a shame. I'm now being attacked by a Jack Russell Terrier as well as
yes,
a Dachshund.
because
So,
do you know that my parsonage is separated by only a lane from Lady Catherine's residence at Rosings Park?
oh, very good, very good. Well, to enjoy the patronage of the esteemed Lady Catherine de Bourgh is quite something. I'm being attacked by dogs, so we better wrap up. But just to say, we will be back next month to give you the October roundup. Who knows what it shall entail? Do any questions, comments, anything we've missed, let us know. If you're watching this on YouTube, then you can let us know in the comments. If you're listening to this through a podcast channel, get in touch. You could do that, royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com. You could find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all Royal History Geeks. Would be great to hear from you. But until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.